It's a tough one, but I knew it going in. I mean, I knew that going in. That was, if we got this right, going in, you want to get it right. You have a responsibility to it, which you can't take lightly. Otherwise, the door will come around and smack you in the face. So if you go in there to do the job and to really get the job done and make the picture work, what you're going for is a successful film. And then what you deal with afterwards is on a day-to-day basis, and a contract for 2 more pictures.
Your director says it may last another 30 years.
Oh, no, I'm not. I've got 2 more pictures. You're going to be, hopefully Brosnan will have the intelligence to get out when the going is good.
And just finally...
Before GoldenEye, James Bond had, with just a handful of exceptions, enjoyed 2.5 decades of dominating the box office, but by the 1980s, his star was fading. While still profitable, Roger Moore's last 3 films each made less money than the other, and although Timothy Dalton gave the series a bit of a shot in the arm, his follow-up in 1989 was, adjusted for inflation, the worst ever box office result for a Bond film. Despite the new actor, there was an inevitable sense of fatigue creeping into this franchise that had pumped out 16 movies in 27 years. It was clear that something had to change, but I don't think anyone expected that, with GoldenEye, everything would change. Not only was GoldenEye the first James Bond movie to be made since the end of the Cold War, but it was also the first Bond movie not produced by 𝗙𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏, and indeed, it would be the last Bond movie released in his lifetime. It was the first James Bond movie to have a new director since the 1970s. It had a brand new writing team, none of whom had worked on a Bond movie before. And with the exception of our beloved Desmond, it had a brand new cast across the board, including, for the first time, Judi Dench as M.
A woman?
GoldenEye was the movie that handed over the James Bond series to the next generation, but it was coming out more than 6 years after License to Kill, what is still, for now, the longest gap between Bond films in the franchise's history. After so many years since the last movie, and after a decade of diminishing returns at the box office, and with the Cold War world that created the character of James Bond no longer even existing, there was perhaps never a better time to ask that classic question of, is James Bond relevant anymore? And GoldenEye answered that question with a categorical yes. From the very start, GoldenEye takes off at a breakneck pace and literally plunges you headfirst, twice, into some of the biggest and most exciting action the Bond series has ever seen, and that's before we even hear Tina Turner's belter of a title song. In a single scene, it firmly confirms that Pierce Brosnan was born to play James Bond, while also introducing us to 𝗙𝗪𝗟𝗏𝗡 playing one of the most outrageous and certainly the sexiest Bond henchmen of all time. It completely modernizes and refreshes Bond's dynamic with Moneypenny and M without losing any of what made those relationships work in the earlier movies. It gives us what is probably the best Q scene in the whole series before launching us into a James Bond adventure that blends classic espionage intrigue with modern blockbuster action that has all of the scale and ambition that only a Bond movie can achieve.
You finished?
No, Q, I'm not, because I haven't even mentioned the fact that Bond teams up with the most interesting and capable Bond girl of them all, at least among those who survive until the end of the movie. In Sean Bean, it has the best version of the dark James Bond villain trope at least since Scaramanga and probably ever, and then it has the gall to team him up with one of the funniest yet most loathable sidekicks in the form of Boris I Am Invincible Grushenko. Oh, and did I mention 𝗙𝗪𝗟𝗏𝗡𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏? And all of this is in service of a Bond story that, for all of its glamour and action and intrigue and evil layers, ultimately becomes one of Bond's most personal missions ever. A mission that forces him to reflect on who he is, where he's come from, and why he does what he does. This Bond movie is so good that even its teaser trailer has near legendary status among Bond fans.
You were expecting someone else?
And as if all of that wasn't enough, it also led to the creation of a video game that to this day is still regarded as one of the most influential first-person shooters ever made, one that revolutionized the genre and, more importantly, introduced a whole new generation to James Bond. So all of that and more is why if you ask almost any Bond fan, they will tell you that GoldenEye is one of, if not the best James Bond movie of them all. And so as it celebrates its 30th anniversary, let's dive into GoldenEye, because looking at all of its tremendous success, and you might be tempted to just put half of it down to luck.
And the other half?
fate.
Maybe GoldenEye was always fated to become a god-tier Bond movie, but when you think about the state of the Bond series in 1989, it's kind of a miracle that Bond 17 got made at all. Licence to Kill had underperformed at the box office, but if making 16 James Bond movies had taught 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪 one thing, it was to dust yourself off and just start making the next one. Timothy Dalton had originally signed on for a 3-film deal, and pre-production on his third movie, Bond 17, began in 1990 with the intention of it being released in 1991. Now, you could make a whole video about the lost third Timothy Dalton James Bond movie, and, well, never say never, but the whole thing got delayed because of the return of James Bond's most notorious and persistent foe, legal challenges. But those of you who watched my history of Thunderball will be surprised to learn that this one, for once, didn't involve Kevin McClory, but rather it had to do with the sale of MGM United Artists, the studio that distributed and co-produced the Bond movies alongside Eon Productions. And without getting too much into the weeds of it, MGM United Artists had been taken over by Pathé Communications and merged into MGM Pathé, the owner of which sold off the TV distribution rights to James Bond for well below what they were worth, and this being the early 90s, TV rights were a major revenue stream for Eon's parent company, Danjaq, that they were now missing out on. So Danjaq sued the studio, which ended up going bankrupt and being acquired by a French bank and renamed again to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So in other words, a series of events about as straightforward as the plot of The Living Daylights. Anyway, the point is that no Bond movie could be made while all of this was going on, and by the time the dust had settled, Eon were facing the prospect of a 6-year hiatus between movies, which sounds par for the course these days, but at the time was a major departure from the precedent of a roughly 2-yearly release schedule. But this delay was kind of the least of their worries at this point, because despite beginning pre-production again on Bond 17 with the full intention of having Dalton return for his third outing as 007, the legal disputes had been going on for so long that his contract had expired. In 1994, he released a statement saying,
"Even though the producers have always made it clear to me that they want me to resume my role in their next James Bond feature, I have now made this difficult decision. As an actor, I believe it is now time to leave that wonderful image behind and accept the challenge of new ones."
Now, there is a little bit of he said, she said about Dalton's departure from Bond, and even though it all seems pretty amicable and professional, all of the people involved have given slightly varying accounts of it over the years, but the consensus seems to be that Dalton was keen to do one more, but 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪 felt that after such a long gap between Bond films, it wouldn't make sense for him to return for just one movie. And Dalton agreed, but he didn't want to commit to several more Bond movies, and so he bowed out. And as if losing their Bond actor wasn't enough, there was a much more seismic shift underway at Eon. 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗪, the producer who, along with Harry Saltzman, brought James Bond to the big screen and shepherded the series through 3 decades of highs and lows, was in poor health. The man was in his mid-80s, and after enduring yet another long and expensive legal battle, he decided that now was the time to pass the torch to the next generation. Barbara Broccoli and 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪's stepson Michael G. Wilson had both been involved with Bond for decades at this point. I mean, Wilson had a cameo way back in Goldfinger, and had been involved in various behind-the-scenes roles for most of the Bond films before GoldenEye. And Barbara's first official role in a Bond movie, meanwhile, came when she was just 17, working in the marketing department on The Spy Who Loved Me, and she then went on to be an assistant director on the last 2 Roger films and associate producer on the 2 Daltons. So they were both very much the heirs apparent, and with 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗪 opting to take a backseat as consultant producer, GoldenEye was their moment to take the reins. And although he hadn't been involved in the Bond series for some time, Harry Saltzman, 𝗘𝗩𝗟𝗏𝗪's original co-producer, passed away in 1994. The old guard of Bond were moving on, and this could also be seen on the writing side. It had already been decided after Licence to Kill to replace Richard Maybaum, who'd worked on every Bond movie since Moonraker and pretty much every other one before that. And so for GoldenEye, Michael G. Wilson brought on Michael France to write a new script set firmly in the post-Cold War world of the 1990s. Now, the Bond films and novels have always taken place against the backdrop of real-world political events, but never before had there been such a massive change in global geopolitics during the course of the series. The Cold War is what inspired and popularized characters like James Bond in the first place, and decades of spy fiction had been set against this backdrop, raising the question of whether or not those stories were even relevant anymore.
Christ, I miss the Cold War.
But as it turns out, it wasn't the end of the Cold War that made the studio doubt the relevance of James Bond for modern audiences, as explained in this excellent interview the 𝗙𝗪𝗏𝗧𝗏 podcast did with 𝗑𝗩𝗘𝗏𝗪, one of the lead MGM producers behind the Brosnan era.
They did a market research study to see what the interest across America was in James Bond and another James Bond movie. It came back that essentially every teenage boy in America either said, "Who's James Bond?" or, "Oh, I know who that is. That's that guy our dad likes," which from a let's go make big blockbuster movies marketing perspective is the kiss of death. For most of them, there hadn't really been a significant Bond movie in their lives to go to. So for them, it really was some archaeological hero that their dad liked.
But despite this rather crushing market research, GoldenEye was eventually greenlit by the studio, albeit on a much more modest budget than you'd expect for a big action blockbuster.
He ultimately agreed to give us $49 million to go make the movie with. By this point, we were already in the era of the 100 million plus action movies. In fact, there was a belief amongst a lot of studios that the only way to ensure a movie would be successful was to spend at least 100 million on it and give it the real sense of spectacle. But GoldenEye at 49 million was really Frank Mancuso giving us a shot, but not big shot.
So the movie was underway, despite the studio not having a huge amount of confidence that modern audiences would still show up for James Bond. It was very much make or break, Bond's one and only chance to prove to the studio that audiences did still care about what they considered to be
A relic of the Cold War.
So facing this seemingly impossible challenge, what did GoldenEye do? Well, it adopted a simple tenet that came from Bruce Firestein, the third credited writer on GoldenEye, who was brought on to help tidy the script up after Michael France's first draft was revised by Jeffrey Kane.
What I did is I came in and I looked at it and they expected me to do something funny, and instead, yeah, I can write funny and I know how to do that, but when I looked at it and I said, the problem here is that there's no kind of overarching idea on this. And they looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, well, I don't know. My feeling is the problem with the script is that we should go through it and everything should be about the world, the way the world has changed and Bond hasn't. And so that affected every single scene in the movie. The first change I made was the first shot you see of the movie, which is the DB5. That was not there. That was, we got to bring back the DB5 because that tells us who we are and where we came from. And then you go through the entire movie, whether it's M or Moneypenny, all through it, the idea is that the world has changed, but Bond hasn't.
The world has changed, but Bond hasn't. It was this idea that makes GoldenEye what it is, and as we'll see later in the video, it is the connective tissue that is woven throughout the entire movie. And if the world has changed, well, so too must there be a change of director. John Glenn had directed each of the last 5 Bond movies, and having worked on the series since Majesty's, was very much part of the old guard. This new Bond needed a new voice and style, and the man for the job was New Zealander Martin Campbell. That's right, we Kiwis gave you Die Another Day, but we also gave you GoldenEye and Casino Royale, which I reckon is a pretty good hit rate. Actually, fun fact, before The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was actually in serious discussions to direct The World Is Not Enough, and so we very nearly had a universe where 3 of the 4 Brosnan movies were helmed by Kiwis. On balance, I think I'm glad that Jackson ended up doing Rings instead, but apparently, whenever he and Christopher Lee were on set together, all the crew got really annoyed because instead of filming the scene, they just kept talking about James Bond.
You know that famous shot of the car?
Yes, yeah, the corkscrew car.
Nobody believed it, you know.
No.
Nobody believed it. I remember Guy Hamilton saying, God, he said, that was absolutely wonderful. Would you do another? He said, that's the first effing time I've done it. I'm not effing doing it again.
Anyway, back to Martin Campbell. Campbell had been working in the British film and TV industry since moving there in the 1960s. And while he never really had a breakout hit, he did have a very strong track record in the action and spy genres that resonated with Eon and, most importantly for 𝗙𝗪𝗏, had been produced on tight budgets.
We end up seeing a cut of Martin Campbell's movie No Escape, which I can't tell you we thought it was a spectacular movie, because we didn't. But what we did think was that it was a well-executed movie, and it got an astonishing amount on screen for what was a very small budget. It felt much, much bigger than its budget. More importantly, what we had seen was Martin's original version of Edge of Darkness, his British miniseries, which we love. So for us, it was this combination of he did this brilliant work in British television that was spot on in our minds for Bond, and he knew how to really stretch his budget and make it look great on screen.
Campbell was just the sort of director the Bond films sought out up until Skyfall, really. Talented but relatively low-profile storytellers with an eye for action, but who didn't have a particularly distinctive visual style or obvious directorial flourishes. Eon just wanted solid, middle-of-the-road directors that they could trust to execute their vision for Bond and to do it on time and on budget. As we'll see later, Martin Campbell more than delivered on this task, and so with the new producers, director, and writers sorted, it was time for the biggest change of all: casting the fifth 007. As with a lot of things on GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan being cast as James Bond was a mix of fate and luck. Bad luck, that is. By the mid-80s, Pierce had had a reasonably active career in film and TV, but like Martin Campbell, had never really done anything that gave him tremendous name recognition besides being the title character in the reasonably popular American detective show Remington Steele. And he'd been on Eon's radar for a little while as a potential successor to Roger Moore, having met 𝗙𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏 on the set of For Your Eyes Only, because this lady was his wife at the time. So when 1986 came around and it was time to cast a new Bond for The Living Daylights, it also just so happened that Remington Steele was cancelled, freeing up Brosnan and allowing Eon to confirm him as the next James Bond. And then this happened.
What had happened was there was a 60-day clause in my contract to NBC, actually to MTM, and then to NBC. And within those 60 days, 𝗙𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏, the late 𝗙𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, and my agents set up the negotiations for me to do Bond. We'd done the wardrobe fittings, we'd taken the photographs, all of this was done down at Pinewood, and the clock was ticking, 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 and we were assured that I was going to get out of Remington Steele. And then NBC said, we'd like the option of 22. Well, no, 𝗙𝗪 said, look, you can have him for 6 episodes, but no more than 6, then he's mine. And the clock ticked, 57, 58, 59, 60. They said, NBC said, we want the option of 22. 𝗙𝗪 said no, and that was it.
Brosnan had to return to Remington Steele for a 5th and final season, leaving Timothy Dalton to take on the role of Bond instead.
Didn't you hate Timothy Dalton at that time?
No, it was nothing to do with Tim. It wasn't personal. I mean, it was business, purely business. And you learn that pretty quickly in this town. And greed.
And greed, yeah.
It was greed from NBC because they wanted everything. They thought they were going to have, a TV star and then an international film star. So you cut your losses and you move on.
Brosnan would have to wait another 9 years before his chance at Bond finally came around with GoldenEye because, well, it feels like fate that he should one day have played the part. Brosnan was the first and arguably still only actor to have played Bond who not only grew up with the series, but who loved it inside and out long before he became the character. Like, don't get me wrong, Dalton and Craig both had a healthy level of respect for the films that preceded them, of course, but Brosnan is a proper fan, and you can feel that enthusiasm and passion come through when he talks about the films.
As a boy in 1964, when I left Ireland, it was the first film I ever saw. It was magic. It was Goldfinger. It was unbelievable. It was a naked lady covered in gold paint. It was just sheer magic. And the man, odd job with the hat and everything like that. It was sheer sophistication. Life changed for me. Now that was a treat, because everybody waits in a Bond movie for the Desmond Llewellyn scene, the Q scene. To do that was just a joy with this wonderful actor who's been in every one of these movies.
Brosnan was born to play James Bond, and in GoldenEye, he embodies the sophistication of Sean Connery, the cheekiness of Moore, the physicality of Lazenby, and the seriousness of Dalton, and yet he still manages to give an interpretation of the character that is his and his alone.
I allowed myself, when I was working on GoldenEye, to take from Connery, to take from Moore, and somewhere in the middle try and find my own space and my own sense of reality and belief and sincerity that I could play the part. You read the books, You read the script, you focus on the script, and you try to be the man.
In GoldenEye, he just has this confidence about him that immediately makes us go, yep, that's James Bond, right from the first second he is on screen. There are very few things that Bond fans are unanimous about, but one of the things we all agree on is that Pierce had the best gun barrel sequences. There's no knee drops, double-handing, hip shooting, or arm flailing here. Nope, this is a gunshot that'll kill you, and just like that, in the first few seconds of the film, we are already being told that this Bond is going to be different. And Martin Campbell doesn't let that sensation go, as we immediately launch into the pre-title sequence and the iconic stunt that saw stuntman Wayne Michaels bungee jump off the 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗦 in Switzerland, which was about as dangerous as it sounds.
I was required to do a perfect swallow dive off the top of this dam from 700 feet. So I physically had to hold this position while hitting really an area in space that would enable me to track away from the wall all the time, and so limit the chances of me actually hitting the wall. When we actually did the shot itself, we realized that I'd only be able to do one jump on each rope because the loadings were so extreme that the rope just wouldn't take it. So we've got all the cameras rolling and all the cameras are up to speed, and the assistant's just about to give me action. And I could see out of the corner of my eye this little Italian crane driver who looks pale with fright at the thought of what I was doing. And just as I was about to go, he does the sign of the crucifix.
This is everything a Bond stunt should be. Dangerous, exciting, and something audiences have never seen before, and man does it lock us into whatever this movie has in store for us. It's almost enough to distract us from the fact that we've yet to see Bond's face, and Campbell keeps that suspense alive for just a bit longer, giving us flashes of his eyes in what must be a nod to Majesty's. But then, of course, we meet our new Bond.
Beg your pardon, forgot to knock.
Quippy humour and a spot of violence, what more do we want from 007, who drops in and quickly rendezvous with Sean Bean's Alec Trevelyan, aka 006. This is the first time in the series we've seen Bond work directly with another 00 agent. In fact, it's the first time another 00 agent has even had any dialogue beyond... And although it's brief, I really love the way these two play off each other in this scene. There's this banter and camaraderie between them as they calmly but professionally go about their mission, and it immediately establishes Trevelyan as an equal to Bond as the pair continue joking and making quips to each other even while being shot at.
Closing time, James! Last score! I'm here fine!
Like the movie does, we're going to come back to Alec later in the video, but while the focus of this opening scene is on his friendship with Bond, Martin Campbell also gives us a taste of his dark side when he unflinchingly kills this unarmed scientist. It's such a quick moment, but Bean's expression just conveys so much of his character in this one action that you immediately get the sense that there's something more sinister going on under the surface. With Bond having placed the bombs, Trevelyan is captured and then shot by the scene-stealing, scenery-chewing General Oromov, played to sweaty perfection by Gottfried John, who is forced to watch as Bond inches his way across the factory behind the explosive gas tanks. It's scenes like this one that really prove how much Martin Campbell understands the ingredients for a good Bond film. It's a tense scene, but with just a squeaky wheel, he still manages to inject humour without undercutting any of that tension.
I mean, don't forget in the last 16 Bonds that humour has been a terrific element. There have been huge pluses. The series hasn't been a success, because of things that didn't work. They've been a success because of things that did work.
Onto the runway, and we bookend the pre-title sequence with a second jaw-dropping stunt as stuntman Jacques Melnouy motorbikes off a cliff into a base jump 30 years before Tom Cruise pretended that him doing that was the biggest stunt in movie history, but, well, I made a whole video about that. Anyway, the bike stunt and this entire sequence of Bond struggling to control the plane are spectacular enough that we totally forget about the geography of a mountaintop military base that's also somehow at the bottom of a dam as Bond, ever triumphant, flies off into the title sequence. The song GoldenEye very much casts Tina Turner as the spiritual successor to Shirley Bassey, and after the newness and energy of the pre-title sequence, this song evokes a kind of smooth nostalgia for the Bond classics of the 1960s. But this sequence is about much more than the music. One of the other stalwarts of the Bond films who had to pass the torch to the next generation for GoldenEye was Maurice Binder, the designer behind all but two of the utterly iconic Bond title sequences. Binder died in 1994, having left behind a legacy that literally defined Bond iconography. Stepping into his formidable shoes for GoldenEye was Daniel Kleinman, who carried on making the Bond titles for every subsequent film besides Quantum. Kleinman adopted and paid tribute to Binder's style, with the silhouetted dances and the guns and the layers of abstract imagery and so on, but he modernizes it by introducing computer graphics and, for the first time since Majesty's, actually uses the title sequence to tell a story. Through the titles, the film explicitly acknowledges the fall of the Soviet Union, confirmed by the 9 years later text in the next scene. So this movie deliberately introduces us to Bond in his traditional Cold War setting, but then immediately jumps back into the present day. The world has changed, but Bond hasn't, because here he is, back in the Aston Martin DB5, which had not actually been seen in a Bond film since Thunderball. After the action of the first scene, this is our chance to show the fun side of Bond as he races on atop through the French countryside. One of my favourite things about Pierce Brosnan's James Bond is the fact that he has these moments where he's just having so much fun. I mean, look at the size of the grin on this man's face. Before the story really gets underway, Pierce Brosnan treats us to a scene that's just pure entertainment, proven by the fact that it ends with the reveal that one of the gadgets in the car is a built-in Bollinger fridge, which is just peak Bond silliness. And down in Monaco, we then get a scene that packs in so many Bond tropes that it would go on to be used to audition future Bond actors. There's the Aston, the tuxedo, the gambling, the innuendos, and both of the iconic lines.
Vodka martini. Shaken, not stirred. The name's Bond. James Bond.
But putting the Bond of it all to one side, the thing that I find interesting about this scene, with all of its glamour and high society, is that it was the exact opposite of what audiences had come to expect from action movies of this era. See, we often hear about how Bond movies tend to follow wider cinematic trends. You know, Casino Royale was the Bourne-esque gritty reboot, From Russia With Love was the Hitchcock thriller, and Moonraker was the Star Wars science fiction movie.
We're not science fiction, we're in fact science fact.
Well, a lot of action movies in the 80s and early 90s were things like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and Speed, where the protagonists were all very working class, everyday heroes. Even science fact movies had this tendency to make their protagonists people who were far removed from high society and the world of the elite, casting them as relatable, normal people just trying to do their jobs. And sure enough, you kind of saw this trend bleed into Bond in Licence to Kill. That movie casts Bond as the renegade lone hero going at it alone, and most of its settings are noticeably less glamorous than Sotheby's and French palaces and country estates. And when Bond does venture into the world of tuxedos and casinos, that is very much framed as the domain of the villain, and a place that Bond doesn't really want to be. But GoldenEye, on the other hand, totally ignores the influences of its cinematic peers. Bond is presented as being part of this world, the sort of person who drives sports cars and goes to glamorous casinos in Monaco just for fun, not as part of a mission, and this is presented as a good thing. And the reason it does that is because the filmmakers understand that, unlike your John McClanes and your Sarah Connors, James Bond is not supposed to be a relatable everyday hero. Bond is a fantasy, an aspiration, and he always has been, so trying to frame him as anything else misses the most fundamental reason of why audiences are drawn to Bond in the first place. In this scene, GoldenEye is putting a flag in the ground and reminding you what makes James Bond different from all of the other action heroes of the 90s, and in doing so, it is telling us why audiences will still be drawn to the character even in this post-Cold War world. Because the appeal of James Bond was never really about the spying. It was because when we watch scenes like this, it makes us want to be the sort of person who drives sports cars and goes to glamorous casinos in Monaco just for fun. It's about us wanting to be James Bond. Anyway, the scene sees Bond once again encounter Famke Janssen's Xenia Onatopp.
Onatopp?
Onatopp.
Onatopp is just such an outrageously fun character, and the reason she works in the movie, I mean, besides Famke Janssen quite possibly being the best looking human to ever live, is because everyone else in the movie acknowledges how outrageous she is. Famke Janssen just understands the assignment so well and dials Onatopp up to 11, because if she played it any other way, then the character just wouldn't work at all and would feel really out of place, but instead we get her saying things like,
"How do you take it?"
Straight up, with a twist.
before cutting to her suffocating this poor bastard to death with her thighs, and, well, I was just talking about Die Hard.
Oh, grow up, 007.
The murder allows Xenia to sneak aboard this French naval ship, and just as Bond figures out what is happening, steal the state-of-the-art EMP-proof Tiger helicopter. And then GoldenEye does something that no other Bond movie has ever done. It gives us an extended sequence, almost 10 minutes, that is told entirely from the perspective of the Bond girl. Like, yes, other Bond movies maybe have like one scene focused exclusively on the Bond girl, but they're all either quite short, like when Melina's parents are killed in For Your Eyes Only, or more often, the scene has something to do with that character's relationship to Bond, meaning the scene is actually about Bond and not the Bond girl. It's like in The Simpsons with Poochie, you know? It's like, whenever James Bond is not on screen, all of the other characters should be asking, where's James Bond? But in GoldenEye, we have a 10-minute scene where we meet Izabella Scorupco's Natalya and her slimy computer geek colleague Boris, played to perfection by Alan Cumming, which, if you were to make a list of male names that had Bond girl-style innuendos, then it would be in third place after Manuel Hung and, well, Roger Moore. Anyway, we see them living their lives and having their office banter when Ourumov and Onatop suddenly show up, steal the GoldenEye weapon, and kill everyone. Everyone, that is, except Boris and Natalya. Oh, and while we're here, can we just take a moment to acknowledge the phenomenal miniatures work by Derek Meddings, the visual effects pioneer who helped bring Thunderbirds to life and who had worked on the Bond movies since Live and Let Die. And these miniatures are absolutely flawless. Like, to this day, you can still barely tell that shots like this one, or this one, or this one, or this one, or this one are all done using miniatures. Like, even this one is a miniature and some forced perspective with the actor. GoldenEye was the first Bond movie to use digital effects in a significant way, mostly adding the EMP blast to shots like this, but by and large, all of the big, impressive sets were actually just beautifully crafted miniatures. Derek Meddings sadly passed away just before GoldenEye was released, and the film is dedicated to his memory. Anyway, after the GoldenEye theft, we do then cut back to Bond and MI6 watching the rest of the scene unfold as the GoldenEye weapon destroys the facility, but the focus of the scene is still on Natalya. We see her ingenuity in hiding from Onatop and spend a moment watching her grieve her colleagues, and then escape death again before finally escaping the facility. It is by far the most time any Bond movie has spent with the Bond girl independently of Bond, and better still, it's not the last time the movie does that. The next time we see her, Natalya is once again using her ingenuity to investigate what happened, and we get this great scene where she pretends to be making a massive order of computers for a school so that she can get online and contact Boris. After going through all of this, Natalya doesn't need James Bond. She's trying to figure it out herself, and I love how much of her character is conveyed through her actions in these scenes. GoldenEye is Natalya's story just as much as it is Bond's, and by the time she meets Bond about 70 minutes into the movie, we've spent nearly a quarter of that time just with Natalya, and no other Bond girl before, or since frankly, has had that level of focus and characterization in the script independently of Bond. But all of that being said, Izabella Scorupco is still the first person to shoot down the tired old trope of being not like the other Bond girls.
I think Bond girls always have been strong. It's just, I don't know, it's a trend, kind of. I think that question is always a little bit pathetic from journalists. Are you going to be stronger in this film? Because I heard that every Bond girl before every movie is saying the same thing, that my character is going to be much stronger this time. Of course we're strong. Bond women have always been strong, I think.
People tend to dismiss and diminish a lot of the Bond girls as two-dimensional stereotypes in a way that often does a disservice to a lot of those actors and their characters, and this is what Scorupco is calling out here, and it's just so refreshing to see someone on a Bond press junket do this. Because if your media lines tell you to say something like, she's not like the other Bond girls, then what this is doing is actually reinforcing that incorrect stereotype, and is also undermining your predecessor's work. I love that 30 years ago, in 1995, Scorupco flipped the script and actually defended not just her character, but all of the Bond girls who came before her, meaning we can finally put that old stereotype to rest once and for all.
Paloma's different to what we are used to see in Bond movies. She's pretty much Bond's partner instead of a girl waiting for someone to rescue her.
Never mind. But look, my point here is not that Natalya is inherently more or less capable as a character than, say, Pussy Galore or Fiona or Aki or Tracy or Anya or Holly or Melina or Pam. No, my point is that the film makes an active decision to center her character arc and story for the first half of the movie in a way that, to this day, makes GoldenEye almost unique among Bond films. But anyway, like the film does, we do return to Bond and in quick succession get reintroduced to the new cast of MI6 regulars. First up is Samantha Bond's Moneypenny, taking over from Caroline Bliss, who sadly got to do very little with the character in her 2 films. And this is yet another the world has changed but Bond hasn't sort of scene that manages to keep the classic flirting and banter between Bond and Moneypenny, but instead of having her kind of fawning over him and going, instead there's this kind of friendly sarcasm to their rapport.
I was on a date, if you must know, with a gentleman. We went to the theatre together.
Moneypenny, I'm devastated.
Moneypenny is refreshingly immune to Bond's charms, but she still indulges him and creates the space for a new take on the old Bond-Moneypenny dynamic.
What would I ever do without you?
As far as I can remember, James, you've never had me.
And in the same way this scene is written in a very different way from classic Bond films, so too does Martin Campbell shoot it differently, and this is a fantastic example of his understated but extremely efficient directing style. Pretty much every single Moneypenny scene takes place in one room, with her usually sitting behind a desk with Bond swanning in, flirting with her, then leaving her swooning in his wake, although props to Caroline Bliss for trying out the world's best pickup line.
Anytime you want to drop by and listen to my Barry Manilow collection.
But Campbell, meanwhile, films this entire scene in a single Spielberg-esque take that suddenly makes this dialogue scene much more visually interesting, and rather than literally stopping the pacing of the film, it keeps things flowing and dynamic. But he also reflects the dialogue in how he stages the scene, and instead of having a passive, seated Moneypenny, he has her standing on level footing with Bond and actually driving the action. Bond is following her as she tries to do her job, and it's just such a simple way of using filmmaking language to emphasize what is being said in the dialogue. And Martin Campbell does this a lot, by the way. He rehearses his scenes a huge amount and then films them in the most economical and efficient way possible, one that centers the performances and natural rapport of the actors by minimizing cuts and letting the scene flow, often with multiple actions happening in a single take. And these aren't flashy, indulgent wonders, they're subtle and discreet and are so well executed that most of the time you barely even register that they're happening, but you feel much more engaged with the scene than you would be if it was shot in a more conventional way. Anyway, the dialogue in the Moneypenny scene is a taste of what's to come when Bond has his briefing with M, scenes that in Connery and Moore's tenure tended to see Bond as this cocky, slightly insubordinate know-it-all who M barely tolerated because he was good at his job. It was a fun dynamic, but it was something that GoldenEye wanted to shake up a bit. Making M a female character was one of the key contributions made by writer Bruce Firestein, and it is such a simple way to modernize and refresh the dynamic between Bond and M.
Bruce, who said the only way you can keep Bond essentially as sexist as he is to have a woman in genuine authority who can call him out on it. And he created the Judi Dench M character. We were still terrified because it was the biggest break, I think, with the James Bond canon that we made with the movie. And after the research screening, we had this focus group. And the first comment is, I don't like that you made M a woman. And someone else in the focus group says, but Stella Tennant, who's, I can't remember which was the head of MI5 or MI6, but the real MI5 or MI6 is a woman.
Yeah.
And the guy said, yeah, I don't like that either. And at that point, we thought, oh, okay, we're fine.
You're just one of those guys. Right, I got you.
Yeah.
But putting aside all of that, casting Judi Dench as M was one of the things that allowed GoldenEye to do something more than any other Bond movie had done, which was to have the characters in the film know who James Bond is. What do I mean by that? Well, characters like James Bond come with a lot of cultural baggage. Audiences in 1995 went into GoldenEye with a preconceived notion of who they thought James Bond was. It could have been a positive or a negative one, everyone's opinion is different, but everyone knows who James Bond is in the same way everyone knows who Batman is. And because this movie establishes that Bond has been doing this for a long time and introduces him as an established 00 agent, it means that James Bond has built up a reputation in the world of the film that is the same as the reputation the character of James Bond has in the real world in 1995. So Bond can still be the same old Bond that we know and love, but because everyone else in the movie also knows who James Bond is, they can acknowledge that reputation and call him out for it.
So I can run down here all dressed up to impress James Bond.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War.
Shaken but not disturbed. Still working for MI6, or have you decided to join the 21st century?
I might as well ask you if all the vodka martinis ever silenced the screams of all the men you've killed. Or if you find forgiveness in the arms of all those willing women for all the dead ones you failed to protect.
It's kind of the movie having its cake and eating it too, because the filmmakers are saying that they are very aware of how a lot of people view the character of James Bond. So instead of just ignoring it and coming across as out of touch with changing social norms, the movie instead makes a plot point out of the fact that the world has changed while still staying faithful to the character. Oh, and the icing on this particular cake is the fact that Bond can also comment on this brave new world.
You're having a pleasant drive in the country and you've got to bring psychology into it.
You've been to Russia?
Not recently. I used to drop in occasionally. Shoot in and out.
You know, this sort of behavior could qualify as sexual harassment.
Really? What's the penalty for that? The woman on the top. That's the trouble with the world today. No one takes the time to do a really sinister interrogation anymore.
But one of the things that hasn't changed is Desmond Llewellyn's Q, the only cast member to return from the previous era because, well, some things never change. This is my favorite Q briefing scene in the entire series because, I mean, it's just so damn fun. Pierce's relationship with Q is similar to Connery's, that of a bored child who can't stop fidgeting with things, but he makes it his own by bringing this wittiness and cheekiness that makes his dynamic with Q more collegial.
A typical leather belt.
Q, I'm familiar with that device.
Q still has the impatience with Bond that he always has, but with Pierce there's this sense of mutual respect and friendship that creeps through, where he can't help but enjoy his work as much as Bond does.
Skiing?
Hunting.
They all said the pen was mightier than the sword.
Thanks to me, they were right.
The writing's on the wall?
Along with the rest of it.
But of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the gadget-laden BMW.
Behind the headlights, Stinger missiles.
The BMW sponsorship was worth about $15 million, which meant that the studio could basically halve their marketing budget. So of course they agreed to put the car in the movie, but the deal came so late in the production that there was no time to write or design a sequence that used any of these gadgets. So sadly, this is the only Q scene where we get teased with a load of gadgets, but rather than letting us see them in action, we simply watch, confused, as they drive off into the sunset.
What about the Stingers?
But thankfully, it's not a gadget-free movie, and equipped with his explosive pen and laser watch, Bond jets off to St Petersburg, and, well, you don't need any more proof that the world has changed than a James Bond movie being not just set, but actually filmed on location in Russia. This was a huge deal at the time, but unfortunately the production was only able to film for a few weeks before it became far too expensive and complicated to shoot a big, logistically complex and dangerous chase sequence there. The main cast never filmed in Russia, but shots like this and some of the tank chase were filmed on location and survive in the final movie. So even though it's not as fully authentic as some of the other Bond locations, there is still enough of the real St. Petersburg shot by the film crew to blend seamlessly in with the sets and stand-in locations that they filmed later in the UK. In St. Petersburg, Bond is led by the CIA's Jack Wade to rendezvous with the one and only Valentin Zukovsky, played by the legendary Robbie Coltrane, and again, watch how Martin Campbell introduces him with a single, perfectly blocked take. This was actually the first scene Pierce Brosnan shot as Bond, and this dynamic between the two characters is just brilliant to watch, as Coltrane totally commits to the Russian gangster caricature, while Pierce plays it dead straight, which allows us to have just as much fun watching the scene as Robbie Coltrane is having playing Zukovsky, but without undercutting any of the tension or danger that Bond has put himself in by trusting him. Zukovsky connects Bond to the mysterious Yanis, the guy behind the helicopter theft, which leads him to a steamy encounter with Onatop that I'm sure was very influential, shall we say, for a generation of teenagers, and also gave us a Bond line that only Pierce could deliver.
You don't need the gun.
That depends on your definition of safe sex.
Bond makes Onatopp lead him to Yanis, revealed, of course, to be Alec Trevelyan back from the dead.
You only live twice, Mr. Bond.
Trevelyan reveals that his family were Lien's Cossacks, and thanks to a history lesson from Zukovsky in the previous scene, we learn that this means that his family were betrayed by the British government, leaving him orphaned and vengeful. But this is also the first time the Bond film series actually acknowledges the character's pre-naval backstory.
We're both orphans, James, but where your parents had the luxury of dying in a climbing accident.
And in drawing this parallel, it makes Trevelyan explicitly the dark mirror to Bond, far more so than the likes of Red Grant or Scaramanga ever were. And Sean Bean was actually a name in contention to play Bond himself once upon a time, but I think he is far more effective here as a villain. He has this coldness about him that perfectly suits the character, someone who knows Bond far better than any other villain had done before, and who we have already seen is more than his equal. It sets Bond up for his most personal mission yet, but not before he finds himself captured and about to get blown up in the Tiger helicopter along with Natalya, who was captured after being set up by Boris. And she's just so funny in this scene, yelling at the top of her lungs at Bond, and I just love how you can tell that this is the thing that Bond is most annoyed about, not the approaching missiles. But no sooner do they escape than they're captured again, this time by the Russians. And while awaiting interrogation, we get our first proper scene between Bond and Natalya, where he convinces her to tell him what happened at Severnaya, and a brief level of trust forms between them that's quickly interrupted, first by Defense Minister Mishkin, and then by an exasperated and insanely sweaty General Oromov, who kills Mishkin. But before he can frame Bond, he and Natalya escape, and so begins one of the most intense and energetic extended action sequence in all of Bond, as he and Natalya run through the archives while being shot at by what feels like half the Russian military. Natalya is captured, but Bond manages to escape using his trusty Q belt. But oh man, is this scene not over yet, because Bond needs to rescue Natalya, who he sees being sped off in Oromov's car, and then something else catches his eye. There's just enough time for the audience to go,
"You're not thinking that,"
before we get this shot. The thing that defines a great Bond action scene is that it needs to be something we have never seen any other movie do, and ideally, it also needs to be just a little bit silly. And Bond chasing a car through the streets of Russia in a fucking tank absolutely fits this bill, and it just gives way to Bond on an absolute rampage, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake while Oromov gets sweatier and sweatier. It's a scene that makes us want to cheer for Bond, and it's just packed full of these funny little flourishes that are just winking at the audience and telling us to enjoy the ride. And we also get, of course, the straightening of the tie. One of the ways that you can tell Martin Campbell and Pierce Brosnan understand James Bond is the fact that they sprinkle in these tiny moments like this, or the dabbing of the forehead with the towel after knocking a guy out, or the tiny flinch of the head when being shot at. These little moments are what set Bond apart, and the best Bond movies are the ones that take the time to indulge in them, and GoldenEye does not disappoint on that front. Natalya is taken aboard a train, which Bond, of course, blows up, to the delight of Onatopp.
He's going to derail us.
A confrontation ensues that sees Oromov killed and Trevelyan escape with Onatopp in their helicopter because, well, are you even a Bond villain if you don't have a trusty escape vehicle nearby at all times? Natalya hacks Boris using the computer to track Trevelyan's next move, and, as she often does, she tells Bond off.
But don't stand there, get us out of here!
After showing off his laser watch, they escape at the last second in a shot that actually had the actors running from the explosion, and then, this being a Bond movie, we cap it off with a joke.
You destroy every vehicle you get into.
And also being a Bond movie, they hook up and we fade away into Puerto Rico, standing in for Cuba, and launch into the final act of the movie. But if there's one thing Martin Campbell loves in a Bond film, it's having a scene of Bond brooding on a beach and having his central character conflict be explicitly discussed. And to be clear, I'm not knocking either scene. I think the best Bond movies need these moments of seriousness because they're what make Bond interesting. But as good as Pierce is, this is really Natalya's scene. She sees straight through Bond here and immediately understands why he's feeling conflicted.
He was your friend, and now he's your enemy and you will kill him.
But she also challenges him to question what this is all for.
All of you with your guns, you're killing your death for what? So you can be a hero?
Bond, of course, gives the only answer he knows, one that, again, Natalya sees through.
It's what keeps me alive.
No. It's what keeps you, though.
It's a reminder that Bond is a character with two halves, the half that loves enjoying the finer things in life, and the one who takes no pleasure in the violence and pain that his job forces him to endure.
I think you're dealing with someone who's constantly dealing with fear and that sense of death and dying, and is someone who also, loves life and loves being that man.
Being James Bond comes at a price, and the purpose of this scene is to remind us of that. After all of the action and drama of St. Petersburg, GoldenEye takes this brief moment before the climax to take a breath, remind us of what is at stake, and what this mission means for Bond before we get into the final act. Bond and Natalya fly around in search of the villain's hidden lair, which, You Only Live Twice style, is hidden beneath a giant lake. And even though this cover works perfectly, for some reason 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 shoots down Bond's plane, thus revealing the location of the lair. But somehow Bond and Natalya survive the plane crash and are strong enough to fight off on top, giving her a death that's just as outrageous and as over the top as her character is.
She always did enjoy a good squeeze.
The reveal of the satellite dish is a truly outstanding piece of effects work, with Derek Meddings' miniature perfectly matching with the real-life dish of the 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 Observatory, an awe-inspiring location that has all of the bombastic scale that you need in a Bond movie. So our heroes sneak inside, and I love the fact that they're working as a team here, with Bond focusing on destroying the facility in a scene that bookends the opening, and Natalya using her computer skills to sabotage the GoldenEye satellite itself. And then for like the 5th time this movie, they are captured again. But 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 can't kill them because
she changed the access codes.
I just love all of the dynamics at play in this scene. Natalya confidently holding all the cards and getting to watch Boris's ego get undermined by the fact that he can't out-hack her, all the while 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 gets more and more nervous that things aren't going to plan, and the tension just slowly ramps up as we, like Bond, count the clicks of his exploding pen until, finally... I love this movie, and then this is all capped off by what is, for my money, the best hand-to-hand fight scene in a Bond movie. Now, there are some very strong competitors for that title, but I'm going to stand by this as my pick for number 1. This is personal for both of them, and you can feel that in the performances of both actors, who give it absolutely everything and just throw themselves into the stunts with this raw brutality that makes you feel every blow land. Oh, and can I just take a moment to controversially acknowledge Eric Serra's score in this scene? I know GoldenEye's score gets a lot of flack in the Bond community, and sure, parts of it do sound pretty dated today, but I think he absolutely nails it in this final fight. Serra was intentionally doing something very different from John Barry in this movie, and made a truly one-of-a-kind Bond score that firmly places this movie in the 1990s, for better or worse. And whatever you might think about, say, the musical choices in the Ferrari scene, I think that the scoring of this climax shows that Eric Serra got it right when it counted. But as this final 00 showdown comes to its end, Bond, nearly defeated, manages to knock 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 from the dish, but at the last second, he saves him. And after everything these two have been through, it all comes down to this. Bond has a choice here, and 𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 taunts him one last time.
For England, James?
But this is personal for Bond, and it always has been.
No.
𝗙𝗘𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪 smashing into the ground cuts with Boris's brilliant reaction to the GoldenEye satellite burning up, and just as the dish comes crashing down to kill Sean Bean once and for all, Bond is rescued by Natalya, who has hijacked a helicopter at gunpoint like the absolute badass she is. And the film gives us one final victory as we watch Boris the Invincible get turned into a human popsicle, leaving Bond and Natalya to celebrate in a field and be so into it that they apparently don't notice the sound of 3 helicopters hovering just out of frame as Wade and his cavalry arrive much too late to be of any use. With Natalya in his arms, Pierce Brosnan's characteristically massive grin is back, giving us a classic, triumphant Bond movie ending that's almost immediately undermined by the decision to play the experience of love over the end credits. Maybe I need to take back what I just said about the music.
I'm strangling the cat.
But look, GoldenEye is a damn near perfect James Bond movie, and 30 years later, it is still just as beloved and appreciated by fans as it always was. And it stands alongside Goldfinger and The Spy Who Loved Me as being among the most important and influential movies in Bond history. GoldenEye came at a pivotal moment of transition and uncertainty for the Bond series. If this movie had failed, that would almost certainly have been the end of Bond. But I think that is why this movie is as good as it is, because everyone involved had something to prove. Barbara and Michael had to prove that Bond could outlast 𝗙𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗪. Pierce had to prove that he was capable of living up to the impossibly high standards that had made generations fall in love with Sean Connery and Roger Moore. Martin Campbell had to prove that he could lead a massive action blockbuster while sticking to a shoestring budget and, for the first time in his career, make it a box office success. The writers had to prove that they could replace the old guard and that a Bond story could work in the post-Cold War world. There's this ambition, energy, and passion in GoldenEye that you only see in a handful of movies, where you can just sense the fact that not a single person was just doing this for the paycheck. They cared about this project, they believed in it, and were willing to give it absolutely everything to make sure it was a success. This was the first James Bond movie being made by the next generation, and they more than lived up to expectations, delivering a Bond movie that redefined Bond for the 90s while still celebrating everything that audiences had loved about the character for over 30 years. And although GoldenEye continues to influence every future James Bond movie, its true legacy for many people is this, the N64 game from 1997. People tend to forget that this game came out closer to the release of Tomorrow Never Dies than to GoldenEye itself, but it was being developed alongside the movie, with the game designers visiting the sets and so on, and that attention to detail absolutely comes through in the game. But GoldenEye's influence and legacy has little to do with its connection to the movie. This game did for first-person shooters what Goldfinger did for spy movies. It instantly revolutionized the genre and introduced brand new tropes and features that would go on to become absolute staples of the format. If you are someone who grew up in the 90s, then chances are this was your first exposure to James Bond, which means that an entire generation of Bond fans were introduced to the character not through the films, but by playing a multiplayer deathmatch at your friend's house. 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗘𝗫 did a pretty good review of it a few years ago that's linked in the description, but if you want a one-sentence summary of the impact this game had, then watch this video of Pierce Brosnan himself actually playing the game while on Jimmy Fallon's show, and then read the top comment that says, "This is like watching Jesus read the Bible." It's hard to overstate just how influential the GoldenEye video game was on gaming, and pop culture, and the enduring success of the Bond franchise.
It was so incredibly popular that it really supported GoldenEye, but maybe equally, if not more importantly, what ended up happening were a lot of kids who did not see GoldenEye in the theaters were at home when their older siblings were playing the video game. It created a whole second audience for Bond who had been too young to see GoldenEye when it was released, and then for Tomorrow Never Dies onward, that audience was now a Bond audience too, thanks to the Nintendo video game.
But in saying all of that, and speaking as a child of the 90s, I have a confession to make. I have never played GoldenEye. Not once. In fact, the only James Bond video game I've ever played is 007 Racing, which frankly is worse than playing no James Bond video game. So if you want to watch this massive Bond fan play GoldenEye for literally the first time, then there is a whole video of that over on my Patreon. And yes, my cat does make an appearance in that video.
Can I get in? I don't have the ignition key. What? Where's the key? No, don't kill Natalya. Don't kill Natalya. So I wonder if there's... What's through here? Holy shit!
And if you want a slightly more informed discussion of both that game and the legacy of GoldenEye, then I've linked below to the 𝗙𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 podcast, who were kind enough to invite me on the show with 𝗙𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 and Dave Schilling to wax lyrical about all of that. You know, in case this hour-long video essay wasn't enough. But to stop with the cross-promotion and to round out this retrospective, well, GoldenEye invokes the name of Janus, the two-faced god that looks both backwards and forwards in time. We've spent a lot of time in this video looking back, but to look ahead, well, right now I see a lot of parallels with where the Bond series was when GoldenEye was being made. The departure of the long-standing producers who had led the series for 30 years, a brand new creative team, none of whom had worked on a Bond movie before, a long gap, perhaps the longest ever between Bond movies, and a world that, as it has always done, continues to ask whether or not James Bond is even relevant anymore.
I think that question is always a little bit pathetic from journalists.
The challenge facing Denis Villeneuve, Amy Pascal, David Heyman, and Stephen Knight is still immense, and I know that they know this. And I take a quantum of solace in the fact that Bond has been here before, and one of the reasons GoldenEye was such a definitive success was because everyone involved wanted to prove everyone wrong. They wanted to show the world not just that they could do it, but that they could do it well. GoldenEye was made by the second generation. It was made by people who grew up loving James Bond and who brought that lifetime of passion into their work. I can only hope that the third generation do the same thing, because if they do, then it could lay the foundation for the James Bond series to continue delighting audiences for another 30 years and maybe beyond. And if this video and GoldenEye have taught us anything, it's that you can completely reinvent and revitalize James Bond without compromising on the fundamental things that have made audiences keep coming back to him again and again for more than 60 years. Because today, as was the case 30 years ago, it is a new world with new enemies and new threats, but you can still depend on one man.
You were expecting someone else?
Thanks for watching, and again, if you want to see me play the GoldenEye video game for the very first time, then you can find that on my Patreon, where you'll also find a load of bonus video essays, including my 40-minute long ranking of all the Bond movies. Links below as well to the 𝗙𝗪𝗟𝗪𝗪𝗪 podcast, who I cannot recommend highly enough. That interview with Jeff 𝗙𝗪𝗓𝗪 that I've used in this video is one of the best long-form interviews about James Bond that I have ever heard, and it's absolutely worth listening to if you want to learn more about Bond history. And when you're done with that, you can listen to their other episodes where they interview the 2 remaining living writers of GoldenEye, Bruce Firestein and Jeffrey Kane, and a whole host of other Bond alumni besides. Thanks again for watching, and as always, Pentex's James Bond video essays will return.